then. Well, welcome everyone. It's lovely to see you all already here. We're going to start with the webinar and then people will trickle in as we go through the introduction. But today's webinar will be on the Symphony of Leadership, a very artistic title for a more creative and artistic presentation as well. We will be reaffirming what matters most for workplace success and professional success. And today we have a wonderful guest, Stephanie Kacoyanis. Also, just realized I have not confirmed how to pronounce your surname. Could you please correct me?
Oh, sure. It was actually very close, Kakianis, but you did a great
Kakianis.
job.
Perfect. Thank you. Thank you so much. All right. Well, it's lovely to have you here today. Thank you so much for finding the time for this webinar with us. Do you mind giving a short introduction of what you do, your experience, who you are, your passions as well among this intro?
Absolutely. And thank you so much again for having me. It's been a joy preparing for it, and I'm excited to have this conversation today. And thanks all for joining. So, yes, I'm Stephanie Kacoyanis, and I'm located just outside the Boston area in Massachusetts. And my career has two prongs to it. I'll explain kind of the more HRE one first, but I work as the Group Benefits Thought Leadership Content Lead at Guardian, which is one of the United States' largest life insurers and a leading provider of employee benefits. So perhaps some of you on the call might have heard of Guardian, but in that role, I oversee our thought leadership content, our marketing strategy, including a lot of proprietary research. I run a weekly webinar series about employee benefits and employee well-being. So it's really fun to be actually on the other side of a webinar for once. Help write long-form content, reports, etc. And I used to also work in PR before this thought leadership marketing career. I was in public relations doing HR benefits and B2B tech at an agency. And then before that, I worked at Harvard University and I held a variety of media relations and communications roles there. So as you can see, span a lot of industries from higher ed to tech, PR, to now being in the financial services industry. So that is one hat that I wear. And I love the thought leadership side very, very much. I also am a professional classical singer. Not that you can tell today because I've got a bit of a cold, but I have a master's degree in vocal performance and perform around the Boston area and around the country in chamber music, opera, oratorio, and have been really fortunate to be able to sing with some truly tremendous ensembles and with some fantastic conductors. So I like to say that in everything I do, there's communication at the heart of it. But yes, I definitely have the more kind of classical marketing and then classical voice careers going on.
That's wonderful. Truly, what a unique set of skills and a unique set combination of experiences and passions. That's truly such a wonderful thing to hear. Well, we will definitely get into a lot of these things in more detail as we move forward with the conversation. But again, thank you so much for being here. It's a pleasure to host you. So without further ado, let's just go over the agenda really quickly. So of course, the introduction, as we have just started. This is a really brief overview of what we will be talking about today, but it's just to give people an idea of what the topic will be. So we'll talk about Stephanie's experience, first of all, with these, both the professional and the passion experiences that she has just shared. And then we'll talk about challenges associated with job hunting. What are they? How can we amend them if they have to be amended? The essential skills, and of course, touching specifically on leadership and its intricacies, and how we develop these essential skills and how employers or recruiting managers can assess these skills as well. And of course, naturally, at the end, we will always leave a couple minutes, at least 15 minutes for questions. So please, viewers, as questions come up, do make a note of them, write them in the chat. We will address them at the end of the webinar. So without further ado, let's begin with the first topic of conversation, which is a question that I had initially when you shared your experiences. So specifically when talking about your professional experience, what would you say has been the most challenging aspect of the work that you do or have done? And this could range from both your experience at Harvard as well as the current workplace, which is Guardian Life.
Absolutely. I think every role that I've held has held challenges, which is a good thing fundamentally, because that's how you learn and that's how you grow. And so all the experiences I've had, whether they're on stage or in an office, have taught me something. I would say that if I had to pick kind of an overview, something of a very broad theme that we're confronting right now, both in the performing arts and in thought leadership, is that uh, the idea is that an audience is going to engage, hopefully, with what my colleagues and I create, whether it's content or report, a webinar, or a concert. And for that to happen, there need to be people that are willing to engage. They need to find this content, whatever form it takes. They need to be interested. And I have to say that attention is one of the most precious commodities that exists right now in any professional setting. And as a species, our attention spans are shortening. A study found that, and this is specific to using a digital device, but the study found that our attention has decreased from around 2.5 minutes in 2004, so about 20 years ago, to 47 seconds today. And I'm sure that a lot of you on the call today can identify and sympathize that we're just competing to try to get anybody's attention, whether it's a prospective client or talent that we want to hire. So the other thing too is that the industries I happen to be in are noisy. There's a lot of oversaturation in the market. Lots of our competitors are saying similar things. They're saying similar things not to be unoriginal, but because they're true. And so they're commenting on things that are very pressing needs. The trick is that we need to find a way to differentiate while also staying true to what we're trying to express. And I see the similar thing too, when in my music career, I sing a lot of new music, music by living classical composers. As many of you can probably guess, that can present some challenges with programming compared to, say, Bach, Beethoven, people that are more consumable, shall we say, from a classical music audience standpoint. The challenge is, how do we get people to be open and to attract them? And I think that, too often, sometimes the answer is, well, let's make it shorter. Let's make it more consumable. I think there's a way to do that correctly, but I also think that there is something to be said for long form content, for listening to a whole symphony and not just one movement. So I would say I haven't learned how to solve that challenge yet. I'm working toward it daily with my colleagues in both of my career paths. But I would say attention spans. It's really, really difficult to make white space for yourself.
Definitely, definitely. To forward that a little bit, I think with the speed of social media today and the amount of social media that's being consumed, especially particularly by the younger people, I think it's continuously getting more and more challenging to compete with this. And precisely as you said, I loved how you phrased it. Attention is the most valued commodity today, and it's the most difficult thing to truly grab in people and in viewers and consumers. And you did mention a few things right now of like making things shorter or making more bite-sized or more digestible, but that's of course once you've already grabbed the attention of the viewer, then you make the content more digestible. But how do you go about grabbing attention to begin with? What techniques have you tried, or what advice do you have for people who might also be, who are most likely also struggling with this competing attentions? And
I think it can look very different, but you have to know your audience. That is at
mhm.
the root of it. Who is your audience and what a problem are they trying to solve? I find very often that if you can frame things in, we know you have this challenge, this problem maybe in your work or in your life. Here's an idea about, have you thought how to solve this? And I think that once it's framed in that way, what's in it for me? Not in a clickbaity way. I don't work in product marketing. Thought leadership marketing is really about educating. It's about making sure that whatever content you're presenting is timely, relevant, and on the edge, something on the leading edge of someone saying, "Oh, that's smart." Of course, the idea is that eventually they'll purchase your service or your product. But you have to capture their attention by giving them something that perhaps they didn't know, or something that perhaps they didn't know that they needed to know. So I think that, knowing your audience and finding a way to communicate something that they might need is the way that you fundamentally do that. Meeting them where they are and then saying, okay, well, if you're here and we know that you're here, let's just go there. Let's take it a step. So I would say that's the primary way to approach it. And I found too that sometimes companies go around this by thinking, oh, we'll do testimonials, we'll show how a past customer or client appreciated what we did and how it transformed their business. Testimonials have their place, but I would argue make it more like a case study. Empower your client, your consumer, to be able to say, this is how we solved our problem partnering with whatever organization you work for. And I find that that makes it so much more active and so much less self-congratulatory smacking of marketing practice, that that has been more effective, I've seen, in capturing attention.
Those are absolutely such wonderful tips, definitely. I think most people or a lot of organizations resort to clickbait, which oftentimes gets frustrating even as a viewer. So those are definitely important tips. I've also noted all of these down for myself included. Well, to move forward, I mean, of course, you need experience to reach these conclusions yourself, right? I mean, of course, you learn from others too, but you need to have experience and to acquire this in some way. So to forward this idea to continue on down the same line of thinking, I mean, what experience, work, or education would you say has contributed to your professional growth the most, and why do you think so?
It's a great question. And again, so many different examples could come to mind, but I think the ones that I have in common are anything that involves working with the public or
Mhm.
working with a client in a client facing role. I think my earliest example of that was working in a restaurant when I was in high school. Definitely learn a lot about how people think and how they act when you're serving them. So I think that that was a formative experience. It was hard work. But then there were some parallels between when I made the transition from working at Harvard in higher ed to then working at the public relations firm and being in that client facing role and wanting and realizing that the best clients want you to be consultative, right? That's the best. They don't want you to just do a transaction and then move on. It's really about how can you partner with them to add something, to add value, to contribute a good idea. Of course, sometimes those ideas may be at odds with what the client thinks or how they've done things in the past. So you have to be really diplomatic and tactful and respectful in how you communicate while also having an opinion, because that's why they're paying you, and doing your best to communicate that. Delivering hard news. Sometimes we would have a launch that people were really excited about on the client end, and the results were perhaps disappointing, didn't measure up to what they were envisioning. And you have to be truthful, and not pull the wool anyone over anyone's eyes because they know, but framing things in a way of like, okay, this happened, this is what we learned, this is what we're going to try next. And I think working in a client facing role, as hard as that was at times, and I had wonderful mentors around me that I was able to grow and learn from, how to deliver that kind of news tactfully, but in a really smart way so that you were still ultimately being productive at the end of the day. I think even though I no longer work in a client facing role, that has served me so well, just learning how to communicate in that way.
Definitely. I share your experience as well. Actually, when discussing this topic with my colleagues as well, I always say that having such a client-facing role has been so instrumental for me to understand what it means to deal with clients, and it is truly such a delicate balance to be agreeable but also have an opinion while being tactful and diplomatic about delivering it, for sure. Um, so thank you so much for sharing that experience. I think again, I think it's a very essential experience for everyone to have. Now, I think we move into more of a leadership role, which is
Mhm.
tangential to dealing with clients, but this was more about dealing with your employees as well, or your colleagues or subordinates. So I guess what I would like to ask about this is, what characteristics do you think are most important for leaders or managers to have, and how might they themselves hone these skills if they do not have not had this client facing role in the past?
Yeah, it's a great question. And I think it's hard because for many of us, certainly for me, becoming a manager for me and from other people that I've talked to does not necessarily include any formal training. And yet, like you say, there are skills that are really important to have. And so, actually cultivating them is often done on the job. I remember one job I had where I was actually at the PR firm, where those of us who were managers got together and we had like a managers forum, and we had speakers come in and we talked about things that had come up in our work and we learned from one another. But that's because there really is no course that you sit down and take how to be a good manager, just like you don't get a course on how to be a good parent, for example. Um, I would say that one of the most important things is that uh, obviously being present and supportive for your team, but also giving your team at the same time space to develop and opportunities to excel so that they build their own professional resume, of course, with accomplishments to their name, but also confidence. And I've struggled, am still working on, to be honest, ways to not be so controlling that you're controlling every aspect of work, which again, in some roles, if you are public facing, or like we do this webinar series, everything has to be correct because we're, presenting things to the public. So sometimes it can be easy to fall into the trap of being too detail oriented for correcting everything. It's understandable. However, if you don't ever delegate, if you control too closely, then your team and you never progress. Why? Because you're still, even though you have a team of people, you're still controlling all these aspects such that you can't think bigger. You can't think more strategically, and that doesn't benefit anybody. It doesn't benefit not only you, but everyone else on the team. When I've seen great leaders and outstanding functional teams, great leaders are people that pull everybody up. They're not threatened by people on their team who might be actually better at something than they are. They see it as a good thing, they see it as an opportunity. And it can be hard to say, oh, I wouldn't have used that word, or I wouldn't have done it exactly like that. But at the end of the day, if it's not incorrect, maybe you let it go and you give feedback in a way that says, hey, in the future, think about this. But assigning your team work, letting them find their own opportunities and then owning them is how I've seen is an outstanding characteristic of a leader, because then they're raising up their team at the same time. And I think you do that just by practicing. Start small. If there's a project that you say, hey, I could totally do this, maybe it would even take me less time, resist that temptation. If possible, delegate it, use it as a learning opportunity, and then build from there. And the results are just wonderful, because sometimes you're just so beautifully surprised by what the people on your team are accomplishing, even if it's something they hadn't initially expressed an interest in, and they find a way to grow and chart their own path. I think that's really essential. I will also say too that, especially in this day and age, I think having a leader who is flexible and as empathetic as possible is essential. I think that there has to be a level of safety on a team for someone to say, I need to take my dad to the doctor. He's elderly and sick, and I need to take some time. Go take it. That is how you also cultivate loyalty, and it's really a necessity, especially in the perhaps they are in some other parts of the world. But I think that having those qualities as a leader, showing people that there's room to be your authentic self, to take care of your life. I don't expect that everyone on my team only thinks about work, and that would be pretty unhealthy. So I think as much as possible, modeling that yourself is a great way to cultivate that.
Absolutely love the way that you phrase this. Actually, I think I'm sure that the viewers will share this too, but having an empowering leader, and a leader that you truly feel you can confide in and trust and feel supported by, is such a powerful experience for professional growth. For me, I know that it has been instrumental at my previous workplace. I've had my manager, who was Christine. She was absolutely wonderful, extremely supportive, and more laissez-faire, while simultaneously giving you a sense of security and support. And that's truly been instrumental for my development as a professional too. But what I would like to pay extra attention to is, I feel like to be able to be more hands off while trusting your team, you as a leader must have enough confidence and security within yourself to be able to think, yes, like it's okay, I can delegate this task even if it takes my subordinate a little longer to complete this, or even if it's not 100% the way that I've envisioned it. So my question here would be, you as a leader yourself, how have you gone about developing this level of confidence and security, and what advice would you have for other leaders to develop the same amount of self-confidence?
I think for everybody, it's going to look a little different. But in my case, what I did was there were certain tasks that I said, okay, which are the ones that are lower risk? Like if they don't go perfectly, it's okay. And then which ones it's like, oh, if something goes wrong or if something mishandles that, if someone mishandles that client, it's going to be a disaster. Find where that line is for you, and then work from the lower risk bucket. And then after a while, you'll be able to go to the higher risk one as well. I also think so. I think that's, just kind of like knowing for yourself what is okay and what isn't okay. Because let's be real, we do have to still do our jobs and do them really, really well. We can't just say, oh, I delegated, so that all got dropped. It's not going to fly. So I think knowing for yourself where that line is. And then I think also with feedback, thinking about how you deliver feedback. I always find that it's most effective to do it striking while the iron's hot if something didn't go really well. But also but knowing when's also the most productive moment to do that. In the moment where if something does go wrong, to maybe jump on that person and say, well, that's wrong, and this is why. Maybe you don't do that. Maybe you take a pause, and then the next time you have a one-on-one, and I highly recommend having regular one-on-ones so that you are communicating. No performance review should ever be a surprise, that kind of thing. When you're in the habit of having regular conversations, then even if there is something that's slightly harder to express or difficult feedback to give, you're already in that cycle of keeping those lines of communication open. So it becomes so much easier and more natural to have that conversation in a timely way without making a really big deal out of it.
Absolutely, absolutely agreed. I'm very curious about your experience and your passions, so I would like to move this conversation more into the art and creative direction. So, given that you have such experience with arts and you are a singer, of course, I want to know a little more of how have arts, singing, and any other creative pursuits that you may have had influenced your work ethic and culture, and perhaps even your profile as a leader.
Well, it's a great question. I'm so glad that we're talking about it. And soapbox moment, I think that everyone at some point in their lives should study a performing art, whether it's music or doing improv comedy.
Agreed. Mhm.
I'm so glad that you agree. It's a great conversation that we're having. And I don't ask that everyone be great at it or do it for years
Yeah,
and years and be an expert. But when you are doing any kind of a performing art or creative art, you're developing so many skills, so many soft skills that I know that your organization, I'm so glad is leading the way on, is an out in front on. You develop confidence, you develop communication skills, you learn how to collaborate. Being part of a choir or an orchestra is just as much about being on a team as being on, a football team. It's absolutely true. You learn listening skills. You learn how to say, oh, well, that just went a little bit unexpected. I have to adjust in the moment. You learn discipline. I mean, I've juggled two careers, as I've said. I've memorized operas in languages that I'm not fluent in. That takes discipline. It takes, obviously, I have that because I have a passion for it and I want to do it. But at the same time, I really think that so many kids that I just anecdotally knew growing up who did art, who, played the guitar in a band, they were better students academically too. And not that it's all about academic performance, but I truly think for brain development and also for time management and discipline, there are skills that just are unparalleled. And there are some obvious examples of how I can say working as a classical singer has helped me in my thought leadership, marketing, PR career. Some of the obvious examples are just getting up in front of people. I'm confident doing that. It doesn't phase me. I've had to get up and sing in front of thousands of people with a cold. That's much, much worse, in my opinion, than getting up and leading a board meeting or running a webinar, in my opinion. But for example, my current boss used to work in radio, and he is just the most tremendous presenter. I've learned so much from him, so natural, interviews people really well. And one day I asked him why, and he was like, well, I used to be a DJ. And I said, oh, it all makes sense. And, being a DJ is maybe not a performing art, but it is in the sense he was performing every time he was on the air, and it shows. But beyond that, I also think that learning any performing art, like I said, if you're doing something live on stage and something goes wrong, you need to adapt in that moment. Somebody forgets their lines, or something falls down and it kind of rattles you. You need to kind of keep going. And I think that one experience that I recall that my performing skills helped in was I was in a meeting one time years ago when I worked at the PR firm, and the client had brought this leader that we had never met before, and somehow he wasn't interested in anything that my team or I had to say. He started kind of lacing into one of his own colleagues, which was so awkward all around. I can't even tell you. And I just remember thinking, okay, well, this is unexpected, but let's pretend we're in a performance and we need to still finish the script. So I don't think that I said anything that was, I don't even remember what I said, to be honest. I don't think it was all that brilliant or consequential, but it was a way to redirect the conversation and say, okay, well, I think we can all agree that what we want to do is get here. And let's talk about some ways that we can do it and just kind of like get through that awkward moment. But I think thinking on your feet is something that any performing artist knows they've been called on to do at least once. And I think that, to bring it, at least in the US, I can't speak for other countries, but unfortunately, there's been a big trend as of late to defund arts education, to view the arts as, a nice to have or something that's ornamental or extra on top of the more core academic subjects. And I think in part that comes from an obsession with careerism, the idea that you only go to school to study something really useful and then you go and you do that thing. But as I've hopefully been laying out and persuading people, the skills that you learn if you major in music or theater or art, these help you even in a more quote unquote traditional business career in so many ways. It teaches you the soft skills that are the things that actually, I think, separate the cream, help it rise to the top and help people excel. So I really, really hope that that tide turns back and people recognize the value of the arts, not only for their own sake and for the enrichment that they can provide, but also in teaching people really core leadership skills too, because I've seen them work so many ways around me.
Oh, definitely. I 100% agree. I mean, this is a topic that we frequently talk about at Morphoses as well, where schools typically focus on just giving expertise and giving context into the just what work is in
Right.
terms of work. But all leaders, I mean, any good leader will agree that the skills that they actually use on a daily basis is, I mean, leadership is more an art than a science, right? This is a known quote that
Completely
people
agree.
frequently use. Um, I I mean, I would be curious to hear your opinion about. I totally agree with this basis that like music and arts is 100% essential, but I'd be curious to know, as a recruiter or as a company, how do you think you would go about trying to identify these skills, given that they might not have like formal education in music or arts? How would you go about trying to identify these skills in your candidates and see if they have this, the ability to think on their toes and this yes and attitude?
I think a lot of it is how they come across in an interview. I think
Hmm.
interviews can be very telling. You don't have to have a formal background in some of these areas to still be really good at them. And at least everyone runs interviews differently, and every role is different. What you're looking for should be different. So I don't, if there's a job where you're going to be doing research and you really don't have to think on your feet, because you're not really going to be leading meetings, then maybe that skill doesn't come to the forefront, and not everyone should be held to that standard. But there are some questions I like to ask in interviews that I think can help get at these. So, one thing is I like to ask people, what are three things that you've done recently? It could be professionally, it could be personally, that you're proud of. And I want to know if, I mean, first of all, that's not really a traditional question. So sometimes it does kind of make people go, oh, what? So it's interesting to see how they react to it. But it just shows that they have confidence. It shows that they're confident in something. And that's something that I like to see because I want people to feel empowered on my team. I also ask the interview question, what are three things you're working on that you want to improve on? And that's also pretty telling because it shows me that, are they self-aware? I think that's what you're talking about with that yes and, like, yes, I am confident and I'm proud of these things, but I also know that I want to grow. And I think having that mindset of being aware enough about where you want to grow, that's one way to help tell if these skills are present, if this kind of intelligence is present without having a classic background in art. I look for that anyway.
I love it. I share this perspective. You phrased it so absolutely wonderfully. I definitely agree. Interviews are instrumental to identifying this and like asking these questions that hint towards self-reflection and this confidence that is actually extremely beneficial to the professional field as well. Absolutely essential. Now, to not dwell on this for longer time and sort of shift just a little bit. I think an experience that's all too familiar for, well, myself included, and most likely all the viewers as well, is that oftentimes we apply to jobs that we are seemingly qualified for, but despite being qualified for a role, sometimes people get passed over, or, well, denied a job. Do you think it's a problem, and how might employers amend this if it is?
There are so many reasons why we don't get a job, and it can feel so demoralizing. And I think, unfortunately, like you say, we're all too familiar. We've all been there. Everybody's been rejected from a job. And the truth is that there are so many reasons why, and a lot of them actually don't have to do with you. I remember I felt so bad. We posted a job because we had to, legally in our HR, like we had to post this job, but we had an internal candidate for it, somebody who was getting promoted and she was perfect for it. So we already had a candidate, but we had to post it. And I was like, think about the people that got a rejection letter who were probably great, but we had this internal candidate and we had to, I'm happy she got the job. She deserved it. But there could be something like that going on. What I think is hard, and experience is important, no doubt about it. And we should value experience. It can be frustrating, though, to try to get a foothold in another industry if you're trying to pivot. When it's like if people are just thinking too narrowly, they may not see you in that, no matter how much you try to play up your transferable skills. And I think that the problem is a lot of employers may think too narrowly about what they're looking for. So, for example, if there are a bunch of people at a company who all had the same academic concentration or major in university, and they had a similar track and they maybe worked in a certain kind of company first and they went here, we are comfortable with what we know, right? And that's human nature. So I'm not chastising anybody for that. But then subconsciously, what happens is that we tend to look for people that are just like us, or just like the people that are succeeding in leadership roles and filling up that pipeline in our companies. That's what I call a resume clone. I think that it's very dangerous to hire people that all have that similar background because you deem that that's really, really necessary. Sometimes, too, I've seen employers looking for a unicorn kind of in a candidate. They want someone who has this background and that background and not too many years of experience, but not too few. And because they can't afford to pay the person a ton of money, as a salary. So they don't want someone too senior. And then they don't really find people and they wonder why. Well, again, there are certainly things like I'm not qualified to walk into a hospital and apply for a job as a nurse. I don't have those hard skills. I just don't. That's inappropriate. But there are times where I would really ask and challenge employers to say, what's actually necessary for this role? Um, you know, and think about how that could express itself differently on a resume. Yeah, of course, if there are hard requirements, you can't pass those over. But there are other things that maybe you don't have to think so strictly about. I remember one time somebody, it was a colleague, hired somebody who had predominantly been a waitress in a restaurant, a very high end restaurant. And she was applying for a job doing coordination work at a summer professional development program. And at first, on the surface, you kind of think like, oh, well, how is that going to help? As a waitress, she was dealing with demanding clients. She was multitasking. She was running around a dining room, making sure that everything was done. That's perfect for somebody who's facing toward the people attending a busy summer development conference and training program. So she got hired and she worked there for years and years and years because she was so good at it. So again, I'm glad that my colleague took that chance on her and didn't just hire like the person who was, majored in education. Because was that really necessary for that role, or were the soft skills of people management, keeping things running, really necessary? So I would just challenge employers: don't put yourself in a box. You can always teach a software program. There are trainings about that. You can't teach those valuable soft skills as easily.
Definitely great. I think especially in this day and age, I mean, hard skills are increasingly accessible. I mean, the World Wide Web is very easily accessible. So if you need a specific training, or if you need, most likely there's a course or a course or certificate available online for you to complete too. But you touched upon an interesting topic, which is soft skills and these skills that are essential. So the question here is, what skills in particular do you think are essential, and how do you advise we all work on them?
There are so many, but I think especially, right now I'm a bonus parent to my a 9-year-old stepson, and seeing him and his friends and thinking about, ooh, what skills do they really excel at, and where maybe could they grow. And I think one of the really essential ones is listening. It sounds basic, but really listening to make someone else feel heard. And I think that, teaching kids not only to describe how they're doing on any given day, but ask others and actually genuinely listen to what they're saying, especially with people they don't know. I remember when I grew up where we didn't have phones, individual phones, cell phones. So I would call my friend's house and be like, hello, Mr. Jones, may I please speak with Adam? And you'd have to talk to your friend's parent, and like make small talk. Oh, how are your parents doing? Oh, they're okay. And like, I remember always feeling like it was slightly awkward, but now think about it. Nobody does that. Nobody has a landline. He doesn't call, his friend's parent and be like, I want to talk to, to Charlie to talk about homework. Like that doesn't happen. So I think we've got to look for other ways, especially with people that you don't know, especially for kids. I'm talking in the context of kids, but even for everyone else, like we've all gotten into that habit. I'm a millennial. We famously, I guess, don't like to leave voicemails, Um, but I would say really listening is key. I would also say thinking critically and connecting the dots. I think so many times being successful in a job is practicing filtering and then digesting information that you're taking in. And sometimes I admit this is something I still struggle with. You're in a meeting, you're taking notes, you're trying to think, and then you kind of miss opportunities to think bigger. And so I challenge myself, and I would encourage anyone who wants to develop this skill, like as you're listening to something, really thinking about it and saying, have I heard anything similar before? Could this relate to something I recently read or something that my colleague said? Um, does this apply to something that I'm working on and that I've been missing? And looking for to find those synergies. You can practice that with reading. You can practice that, any number of ways. Listening to a podcast and say, okay, what did this person just say? And kind of that recall, and then taking it one step bigger. I think those critical thinking and ability to connect the dots, that's what I find really makes for a smart colleague, or just a smart leader.
Definitely. To follow up on that, actually, I mean, I know that we briefly already spoke about how we would go about finding these skills and identifying these skills as companies, but I'd be curious also to sort of adjust the question that's on the screen right now a little bit to ask, as you've already hired a candidate, what do you think is a trial that comes up during the experience during which the companies or the employers are able to truly see whether the candidate that they hired has what it takes to succeed? Like, what are the trials that you might encounter during your tenure that will actually demonstrate whether you were a good candidate for this role or not?
I think sometimes it's how you deal with something that doesn't go as planned. I won't even say a failure, but just like, oh, it didn't quite go the way we thought it would, and how do you move on from that? And if they show an aptitude for self-reflection and saying, next time I'm going to do that differently, that to me is a wonderful sign, because it shows that they're able to like see what happened, not go to pieces over it, but just say, hey, next time I'm going to do this differently. And this is what I learned. I think that there's nothing more validating than seeing something like that, because it's easy when things go right. It's easy when every single project, the deadlines all go and everybody does their role right on time. We know in practice that rarely happens, right? So there are challenges, there are roadblocks, sometimes for a really good reason. Maybe the parameters of a project change because they change, because we are developing a new product, or somebody else got hired and is taking over and has a different view on things. Reasons why change can happen. Where I get frustrated is where I see people say something like, well, I don't typically handle that, so I'm just not going to do it. Yeah, of course. If they're asking you to do something monumental that's not your job, you do need to speak up. But in general, being so rigid doesn't bode well. So I also get, that's where I think it can be dangerous, even though, yes, of course, it's very important to outline roles and responsibilities. But if somebody is so rigid that they won't help out, or they won't kind of say, okay, I know usually person X does this, but person Y asked me to do it. So, okay, I'm just going to do it, and kind of figure out why. Um, and not make a big fuss.
It seems like we may have lost connection with Stephanie briefly, but No worries here. I mean, as she was saying, there's definitely a lot to reflect on. I mean, when something goes wrong, you need to definitely shift your focus. You need to think on your toes, just like what, as she was saying previously. You need to adjust and readjust to the new circumstances and make sure that you don't lose track of what was going on previously. Oh, here she is. She is back. Welcome back. I was just
Sorry, I
summarizing
don't know
what you
what
were
happened
saying.
there.
No worries at all. But yes, you were making a wonderful point. Absolutely. I mean, when dealing with failure, when dealing with uncertainties or surprises, let's say, that's when the trial truly happens. I mean, you really see how the person handles this mishap, let's say, and then how you move forward. To also, with respect to the time, I mean, we only have one last question to go over because it's absolutely essential to cover right now in this day and age. I mean, especially post COVID, so many things have changed. I mean, remote work is so much more popular, right? So many things have shifted online. And in this technologically evolving world, how have you seen leadership and management evolve, if at all? Or how do you think it should evolve to adjust to all the new technology that we have, including AI and all these online tools as well?
hmm Yeah, I think that COVID cert yeah, COVID certainly played a role in this. Um, I think that managers today really need to be attuned to changing dynamics and changing employee expectations on their team. And I do think that the pandemic was really a reset point, an inflection point, if you will, where people, for the first time, where the work-life balances came more out into the open. Technology as friend and potential foe came up as well. And I think that just making sure that managers are attuned to the different expectations their workers may have and knowing that one size doesn't fit all. Take a survey, even informally, on your team. Find
Minor technical difficulties. Bear with us, viewers. She will be back soon for sure. Um, but to forward her point once again, definitely you need to keep in mind all of these. I mean, take the feedback from your employees as much as possible, because truly they are the ones that are most familiar with their own experience. And with the technology that we have today, I mean, it is easier to gather feedback, and it's easier to just send out a survey, right, and ask people their opinion. Um, there she is. She is back.
Hi, I'm sorry about that. I moved to a
No
different
worries
place in
at
my
all.
house in case maybe it's my internet being weird. But yeah, you really teams to figure out what's meaningful for them. I remember when the pandemic first happened, at first it was really novel and fun to have trivia happy hours with my team. And then it became like, oh, this feels so forced after a little while. And these methods of engaging, became a little bit stilted. What I will say though is that I think there are, everyone reacts differently. I work remotely predominantly. I really like it. Other people will feel differently because everybody has a different personality. I think what managers need to be careful of is making sure no one on their team is feeling terribly socially isolated. And I think that it's hard to know. You can't just ask, like, hey, are you feeling socially isolated? But think about who might be at risk. If somebody has perhaps mobility or a health condition that prevents them from getting out very much, if they live alone, if they don't talk too much about having a lot of friends or hobbies or things that routinely get them out. These are just the people that, again, you want to be careful that perhaps they're not getting so sucked into remote work that they're not honoring and helping cultivate other areas of their lives. So encourage them to join something in their community or pick up a hobby. Make sure that they understand that you're there to help them lead a great life, not just at work. Not that you involve yourself in their personal lives, but I think making sure that you're modeling again that behavior where you have a full life, that can help prevent some of the burnout that I think we're seeing a lot, because it is something that managers do need to be concerned about. And when you're not seeing people on a day-to-day basis like perhaps we were in the past, it can be easier for things like when people are feeling detached, for that to rear its head.
I feel like we circled back also with the to the need of being tactful and caring towards your colleagues. And in order to be so diplomatic and supportive as a leader, you need to know where your subordinates and colleagues are at, mentally speaking, psychologically speaking. And to do this, you need to ask for feedback, right? Project this confidence and be secure in yourself to be able to have this confidence to be supportive. Those were all the questions that I had prepared for today. Thank you so much, viewers, for your attention. And thank you so much, Stephanie, for such important and interesting delivery, as well as
Oh, it was
important
my
information.
pleasure.
That it was such a pleasure to have you here. We can give 2 minutes to viewers. If anyone has any questions, please do write them in the chat and we will review them. But do you have any closing thoughts, Stephanie, while we wait to share, or anything else that you might want to add that you didn't get a chance to?
I'm just so glad that an organization like Morphoses exists. I think its mission is so important, and I'm so glad that people are attending these webinars and wanting to learn more about them, because I truly think that there are a lot of challenges that we all face, wherever we work, but especially as people leaders, to making sure that we've got people that are thriving and that we're not just obsessed with results, and learning these hard skills that are very important, don't get me wrong, but also cultivating the other side of ourselves, so that we can be more effective, not only at work, but in our families, in our lives, in our communities. So thanks for everyone for coming. It's just been so much fun to have this conversation.
I agree, and I've learned so much from you. Thank you so much again. Looks like we have no additional questions, so we will wrap up here. But it was such a pleasure to host you, and thank you so much again for sharing your valuable experience. I hope you have a wonderful day, and the same for all of you. Have a productive
Thank you
week
so much for
and a
having me.
wonderful, restful weekend. Thank you, Stephanie.
Thank
Bye-bye.
you. Thank you so
See
much
you
for
soon,
having
everyone.
me.